first name up there? P-E-R something.
Persian.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is just a quick review of like kind of what leads into Second Temple Judaism and where we encounter Jesus, and that the Babylonian exile of the southern kingdom of Judah. The Babylonian exile ends with the Persian kingdom taking over everything and allowing the exiled Jews to return to their homeland. And while they're there, they kind of begin to sort of reconstitute themselves as a people. They reconstitute themselves politically, religiously, centered around. They start to compile their Bible. They start to really. Much of it's been written. Some of it maybe still being written a bit, but they're starting to kind of. The one thing I said last week was that there's usually a kind of organic canonicity that starts first. And then later, canonicity, like where something becomes an accepted body of literature, like how the books of the Bible are the books of the Bible because they're agreed upon. There are other books too, but they're less agreed upon. So some are in the Bible and some are not. The Hebrew Bible starts to kind of have its organic canonicity. I have to confirm this, but I feel like I don't recall exactly when a more formal canonicity of the Hebrew Bible is happening, or whether that even maybe happens closer to rabbinic Judaism, even after the time of Jesus. But
let me look it up.
I think, but in any event, a lot of at least the organic canon is kind of being established.
Because they have to have something in writing by then.
Yeah, a lot of the organic canon is being established kind of in Second Temple Judaism, but a lot of other stuff is being written too, and this leads to a lot of doesn't necessarily lead to sectarianism, but it proliferates during their sectarianism. But they get back into the land, and then Persia kind of falls away to Rome, Alexander the Great just takes over everything, and they, in taking over Palestine, run up against and the people that follow Alexander, the Seleucids. They take over that region. They run up against the Maccabees, who actually institute for a while. They actually institute some sovereignty in the region under Jewish rule. They actually rule themselves for a while, and unlike prior to the exiles, where ostensibly they were supposed to be being good Jewish people following good Israelites following the Torah and everything else, there's a whole lot of breaking of the Torah, a lot of just not doing it, a lot of polytheism, a lot of paganism. But when they come back from Babylon, they're so concerned with being Jewish, so concerned with identity, so concerned with it that they actually begin to break into factions over how to do it best, right? And you get, who can name some of the groups of, some of the sects? Can you name some of the sects in Second Temple Judaism? Who did Jesus talk with and bump up against? Do you remember?
Pharisees and
Pharisees.
Sadducees.
Any others? Essenes. And there are various groups that we tend to talk about them as though they're as though they're like a strong militant component in the nation. We call them zealots, but actually it's a much more random, much more ragtag groups, and they're not even consistently that fervent. Like, there are some periods where they're more so, there are some periods where there are less. But
Are the Samaritans in there too, or are they completely different?
The Samaritans are a great point, because they consider themselves, they are relevant, they are there, they are kind of a religious identity apart, but it's not in quite the same way. Like, all the Essenes, any particular brand of zealot, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they'd say, we're all Jews. All of us are Jews. You guys are just doing it wrong. Mm-hmm. The Samaritans would say, we're Israelites. And that's a little bit different. Because not only do they consider themselves a remnant portion of the northern kingdom, different from Judahites, but related, but different, they do have their religious differences in that they say, none of you Jewish people are doing it right, because as soon as David took worship to Jerusalem and away from here, away from Gerizim, where we are, as soon as you guys transferred all that over to Jerusalem, that was all invalid. None of that. So they don't actually use much of anything past the Torah. The Hebrew Bible is inconsequential to them except for the Torah.
Question. Okay, I understand sort of kind of what you're saying, but in present day, when you look at, the area, on tours of this, that, when they have Palestine separated, you can't go near it.
Yeah.
And then they got the other area, and even though the holy temple of something or another, and don't even go there because they'll shoot you or something. Do you know what I'm saying? Kind of, sort of.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is though.
Are you saying, do these sects, like the
I'm
Essenes,
comparing the
Sadducees-
two, kind of, sort of.
Yeah, the difference is
And kind
that
of, sort of, is it the same sort of? Kind
they're
of?
No,
not exactly
it's more
the
like
same.
denominations.
Yeah.
It's more like orders, Catholic orders. Like you might be a Carmelite, or you might be a Jesuit, or things like
Okay.
that.
Or even like Protestant versus
Right.
Catholic versus Eastern Orthodox
Right, and
or
we all
something
say
like
I see
we're
what you're saying.
Christian,
Yeah,
but
Well,
we're
they-
doing it right.
but they would still all say that they're Christian, and all of them would still say that they're Jewish people. The outside threat is really Rome, and
So they don't want to be separated. That's why they call them sectarians.
sectarians. Well, they do want to. They do believe that like they're doing it wrong and we're doing it right, and so there are some strong feelings in there. But they would all agree that once upon a time the Greeks were trying to make us too Greek, and that's not okay. And now the Romans are coming in here and trying to rule us and whatever, and we should be, they still see outside threat as greater.
I found a date.
For
It's about 8100, around there, that the Hebrew texts had begun to be gathered into one.
8100.
Yep, it says Hebrew scriptures then had previously been, okay, before about 8100, there didn't exist a single standard
AD
text.
100.
AD.
Sorry. Okay,
was
I saw your face
I was
now.
trying to figure out what the year
AD 100.
was.
Okay, so it was
18.
after. I thought it was after the time. Yeah, I thought it
Yeah,
was after the
AD.
life of Jesus.
About then, and then later
Yeah.
in 600.
The Masoretic
about the-
text.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
the Masoretic text
Yep.
comes much later still.
History of the world.
Sorry.
8100. I'm like 8100 hasn't happened yet.
But it will.
Around 8100. Yeah. So this is one reason why it's so interesting is that when you say what was the scriptures, because when the New Testament writers are talking about the scriptures, not only are they not talking about the New Testament because either it didn't exist or they were actively writing it. You have to wonder what there was also no formal canon. There was definitely by this point something like an organic canon that was growing, but there was a lot of literature that was not just being written but also being used. People quote the Book of Enoch in the New Testament. That's not in the formal Hebrew Bible canon. It's also there are other things that are being used. The Essene community, there are dozens and dozens more psalms that were used by the Essene community at Qumran that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that are not at all in the New Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. So there are lots of things that are so it's very interesting. There's a lot of literature that we're very fortunate to have now. We don't know what's lost, but there's a lot of literature now that we have from Second Temple Judaism that is really informative about Jesus. But Rome sets up a guy who is only half. He's Idumean, so he's not Jewish, but they set him up as the king in Israel. They're like, he has their stamp of approval to rule the region. But he's not Jewish, and so that always sits uneasily with the people. But he bolsters his claim to the throne by marrying a Hasmonean princess, the Hasmonean dynasty is the Maccabees. So he bolsters that. The Maccabees, this only happens like 130 years before Jesus. Mm-hmm. It's not that long, and memories are longer for people then. Mm-hmm. There are even indications that some of the phrases that Jesus used can be traced to the writings of the Maccabees that you would find in Second Temple texts. But Jesus is born into this. He's born ostensibly in Herod's reign, which means he's born before year zero, which is, or year one. So he's born in like 4 BC, before Christ. He's born before he's born, as I said. So then, and he, let's see. So we mentioned last week that use of the term just is a very good way to diminish something. So a lot of people who they look at Jesus and they'll look at Jesus and kind of, I don't believe any of that about him. I think he was probably just a great teacher. We're like, okay, that's no small thing. A world famous, like history
So you
famous.
just won the silver medal.
Just right, right, exactly. So yeah, it's interesting. But in the Jewish Encyclopedia, they describe Jesus as the founder of Christianity, and they say that there's nothing in his message that is essentially anti-Jewish, but the tone that was adopted was altogether novel in Jewish experience. The prophets spoke with confidence, declaring the word of the Lord, but Jesus adopted equal confidence. He adopted equal confidence, but he emphasized his own authority, which was unusual. And the Quran even has Jesus as a prominent figure. Mary as well. They're actually, I think, I was talking with somebody yesterday that she gets, what's that?
She almost gets more
cred
than he did.
Yeah, she might be mentioned more than he is. I think somebody said that yesterday, but I'm not 100% sure. But it says, yes.
I think she even wrote something that was not included in the Bible.
I think you're thinking of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene.
That could be it.
Yeah,
And
that's
it wouldn't be
different
actually
Mary.
written by her. It would have been
Like,
in her tradition.
Yeah.
right, but
In
they
her
wouldn't
name.
allow it to be put in the Bible because of her.
Being female,
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
it's okay.
Yeah. Well, so anyway, the Quran says, and in the footsteps of the prophets caused we Jesus, the son of Mary, to follow, confirming the law which was before him, which came before him. So, and then there's one of the earliest biblical things. Paul says, although he, being Jesus, although he existed in the form of God, he emptied himself, taking the form in the likeness of mankind. So that is a very high way of viewing Jesus. It's not just like he's a guy in Palestine. He's a guy in Palestine who did some great teaching and he was a great rabbi and we believe in him. Even as early as Paul, we have this kind of exaltation of Jesus as being part of what
The realm of
God, yeah.
Yeah.
So the name Jesus comes from Jesus, which is Greek, which is a Greek form of Yeshua, the Hebrew, which is short for Yehoshua or Joshua. So Jesus and Joshua are the same name.
And if we remember our Joshua's report, he included that. Were we cool?
Yeah, he did. He put that in there. So
That's
and
why he chose Joshua.
yeah, and
Joshua and Yahweh is the same word.
no, Joshua and Jesus are the same name.
Yes, I understand, but then when there's thing it says.
Yahweh
Well, because
is
the
God.
name Yehoshua means Yahweh is salvation.
Okay.
Yeah, and and it's interesting how sometimes these names. So, for example, the name James, we were talking about this. The name James is actually Yaakov. So Jacob and James are the same name. I don't know how it becomes James, but
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
it Dimitri James also?
Dimitri. Somebody said that. I might be.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are some different. There's Sean is John.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because they don't have a hard J sound in Gaelic. But anyway, so Jesus and Joshua are the same name. The word Christ is simply a Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach. Mashiach,
Which
with
sounds like
Messiah.
Messiah, right?
Is
And
that
it's
written here?
yeah, it's
Okay, I
it's
see
the
it, I
second
see
point.
it, Yeah.
Both of the words Christ and Mashiach both mean anointed. It's where we get the word Messiah. Many people throughout the Bible are given or claim. Many people throughout the Bible are given the term Messiah. All kings are anointed, and so they are all messiahs. All any person who is anointed is a messiah. There are even the Cyrus of Persia is called a messiah by the Bible because he saves them from the Babylonian exile. So, but then also in this period leading up to Jesus' birth, there were multiple groups and incidences not terribly far away from the region where Jesus himself comes from, that where people rose up and claimed to be the Messiah and started movements, and they were put down by Rome. And so it was not that weird or rare for somebody to say, I think they're the Messiah, or I'm the Messiah. It's not actually.
Wasn't that what Saul did? Was he went around and found Saul when he was Saul?
Saul meaning Paul? Is it
Yep.
Saul Paul?
Yeah.
Not exactly, no, because it
No?
wasn't really. No, he didn't like the movement. He was opposed to this movement.
Am I taking them with me?
That'd be great. If I could.
You
Yeah.
want me to be there?
I'll meet you there. Send me the address.
Thanks for the great music today.
Yeah, it was awesome, that was really, really good. What
So
you're saying-
you're gonna get them lunch then?
Yeah, I'll
What? Okay, I'll grab something for
What
myself.
you're saying, is that similar to like Jim Jones and some of these other self-proclaimed guys that say, oh yeah, I'm God, I'm Jesus.
They might not say that.
Well,
they are.
not necessarily, because it's important to remember that sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Well-
They say that they're representatives of God.
Yeah, it's
That's
important to
what-
remember that what they were expecting from the Messiah, these guys that were claiming to be Messiah were not claiming to be God. The Messiah is not necessarily equated with God. The Messiah is, particularly in a lot of the Jewish tradition, there is an expectation of a Messiah that's going to reinstitute a sovereign Israel and reinstitute certain aspects of Israel as a nation and throw off the yoke of other, the yoke and influence of other cultures that you could argue taint the role and purpose of Israel in the world. So it could be, in the eyes of some folks, it'd be a much more militaristic leader would be the Messiah, and some folks it'd be a great religious leader. There's a figure that's referred to in early or in some Second Temple literature as the teacher of righteousness, and this person might easily be identified and called a Messiah. So
Kinda sounds scary.
yeah, well, it's not. Well, actually, the teacher of righteousness thing is very closely tied in with the Jesus story.
Okay.
But so the Bible has Jesus born before Herod the Great died around 4 BCE. It also has his birth connected to the census of Quirinius, who was the governor of Syria, which would be 10 years later. So it actually makes it hard to date Jesus' birth and age. And in fact, though he's generally thought to have lived into his early 30s before he was crucified, there's a spot, I think in John, where people say, who are you to talk like this? You're not even 50 yet. Which has made some people think, well, was he maybe in his 40s?
Yeah.
So it's actually hard to date exactly when he was born and how old he got to, but he was not a particularly old man. Most people agree he was probably in his 30s when he was put to death. He was put to death by Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea, sometime before the end of his governor. That's the thing, is that we can date his death fairly well because we know when Pilate was governor. And his governorship ended in 36 CE, so we know that he was put to death before 36.
Quirinius, yes, governor of Syria, Luke 2.
Governor of Quirinius, Syria, yeah. Jesus' family, that his genealogy, the genealogy given suggests that he is of the Davidic line, which is one of the things that is thought to be a qualifier for like the Messiah that's supposed to be coming, the expected Messiah, that he would come from the Davidic line. But it gives his genealogy.
It's interesting that they said this at church this morning.
Yeah, it gives his
Before he
genealogy
even
through
knew
Joseph.
that-
Well, in Matthew, the first chapter of Matthew, it's like 14,
Yeah,
they do
14
the whole
between-
line, 14,
Mm-hmm.
14 years or something like that.
14 between Moses and the
14
next guy,
Yeah.
and then 14 between that guy and the next guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So-
we talked about that.
But it's interesting that they give his genealogy, his connection to David through Joseph, who ostensibly is not his physical father. Now, there are early church attempts at kind of reconciling this by also saying that Mary, too, comes from Davidic lineage.
I heard
So-
that.
So there's some early stuff on this. But Jesus has family. There's a lot of debate about exactly what it means, whether these are half brothers, whether these are half siblings, full siblings, or maybe close cousins, because the word that is used, A what? God cousin.
That, oh, then,
God
it
cousin.
was a thing in Harvey, trust me.
In Harvey. Oh, in Harvey, the
It's a,
township or the
Cultural.
movie with the rabbit?
yeah, it's my
Oh.
god cousin, it's your godmother's
Oh, gotcha.
kid.
Kid.
Probably
African
That's
thing.
yeah.
It's not just
Yeah.
Harvey, probably. It's an African.
I know, yes,
Yeah.
it's that, yeah,
Yeah.
it's,
Like Father God.
It could be,
it's your god,
It's your
god,
Godmother,
Godparents'
godparents'
children.
kids.
Yeah.
and they're not
right,
also relatives.
right,
Like a kissing cousin type of thing.
sure.
I
so,
don't know.
That's a different story.
well, so the
I don't know.
well, so after, so anyway, he's
That's somewhere you can-
the word that is used, adelphos, for brother, can be used for close kin. So it's not 100% sure, but it is interesting and important to observe that family, it's got this really interesting and ambivalent relationship in the Gospels, but it is not Peter who is put in charge of the church after. It is not any one of the disciples who is put in charge of the church after Jesus' death. It's James, Jesus' brother. And the person who takes over the Jerusalem church after James is put to death is Simon, the next brother.
And the reason this mythology behind that is a certain branch of the church wanted Mary to remain a virgin her whole life.
Right.
So therefore, oh my gosh, she couldn't have had a birth more children.
Yeah.
So that's a
Is that
later.
bad?
No.
No. In
That's
fact,
a
we read
later-
the scripture today that says
That's like
clearly he didn't have sexual relationships with Mary until.
until
Okay,
after the
okay.
first was born.
So,
That's just to justify
yeah.
what everybody else does these days.
So
Right.
when did Peter come in? When
Peter, well, it's interesting. Somebody made the observation that, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the early church. But Peter actually, somebody made the observation that being given the keys to the kingdom, the keys are usually held by like your chamber, like your second in command. And so, rather than being the person who is given like primacy, like you're the guy, you're the leader, you're actually from being maybe Jesus's second in command to then James's second in command. He's the like lieutenant, or he's the chamberlain, or he's the guy who holds the keys, rather than being the guy who makes the decisions. He is counted in the early church as a pillar, James, Peter, and John. But it's interesting that he's not given leadership per se. He's not given direct leadership. He's sort of second in command, and he, unlike James, who remains the bishop of Jerusalem church, he goes out and does other things and ends up in Rome, where he's put to death. So he does a ministry rather than a bishopric, right? Although he sort of then famously gets counted the first bishop of Rome. I don't know of any immediate history of that being like a strong thing, like something that really typifies what he did in life. That he went there, and that there was a community, and that he was involved and put to death. But he spends time in Antioch where he argues with Paul, where Paul defies him to his face. So how much time he spent in Rome, how much time the degree to which he was revered as an apostle versus revered as a leader of the church, like you're the guy, you live here now and you're our bishop. It's hard to say. But in any event, he's put to death, and so it's not a terribly long, and other people are then known to have taken over after him. But so anyway, his family, his sisters, plural, but they're unnamed. But his brothers are named. James. I know, right? James.
Nothing compared to
They're the
us
top
guys.
Yeah, James, Joseph or Joses, which is another variant of the name, Judas or Jude, and Simon, and then the unnamed sisters. James and Jude, both, potentially the authors of books, letters in the New Testament that are ascribed to them, we'll say.
Is that the Judas?
No.
No,
No.
different
It's a
guy.
different one.
No,
Okay.
it's interesting because the name Judas actually shows up. We talk about how John is there are multiple Johns, there are multiple Marys, there but what's interesting is that Judas there's Judas Iscariot, there's Judas, the name of one of Jesus's brothers. And then there's also Thomas. The name Thomas means twin, and there are early ascriptions, including a gospel, to Didymus Thomas Judas. So there are some scholars who think that Jesus may have had a twin named Jude or Judas.
That's weird.
Hey, Jude.
Yeah, and so these are just a lot of these are speculation, but the question of whose twin he might have been, maybe he was somebody else's twin, maybe he was James's twin, who knows? But the question of whether or not the Judas that is maybe Thomas's name was Judas and he was called Thomas because he's called twin. So there are multiple Judases, there are multiple Johns, there are multiple Marys, and it can get pretty hard to suss out who's who. After Jesus' birth, there are only two gospels that list Jesus that tell the story of Jesus' birth. Mark is the earliest gospel, but doesn't mention it. Matthew and Luke are the next oldest gospels, and they both have the story. John is the latest gospel, but there are arguments that it was written by somebody who may actually, I'm willing to entertain. It's late, and he would have been very old, but then John was known to have been very old. It's hard to say exactly which John it was.
And if you think about it, we have stories that we tell about our parents and, in the generation just before, and even before that. So, and it was oral history, and so they had to memorize things.
Yeah.
So
So it could have been like a great grandfather or something.
no,
Well, it's probably
it
closer
might have
to
been-
that.
Yeah, closer to. He might have been a young person, but
If he was a young person, he
in
could have
the
been
whole
70.
community. He was within the whole
Yeah.
story.
There's no reason that a person, the main thing, and this is something that people don't talk about enough, that we talk about life expectancies back then. But the truth is that if you made it past a certain age, there's every possibility that you were going to live to a perfectly normal age. Now, we live a little bit longer than that on average, but the average creeps up by years at a time. A year, 2 years, 5 years, maybe more people who are 85 who are still alive than your grandparents did. But the truth is that for you to be living in Galilee at the time and be 70, you'd be an older person. But that's not that weird. What really brings that number down is infant mortality and death in childbirth, and for women, and just the standard contracting of diseases. But if you don't get those diseases, it's not we just unfortunately live in 7 AD, so I'm not allowed to live any longer, and you just die at 550. It's if you avoid serious diseases or accident, you could live to 70. That's not a problem, or even 80. Yeah. But so John, whatever Johnny was, if he was a young man when he knew Jesus, even 20 or something like that, he could have been between 70 and 80, and more importantly, he was known to have been.
You talked about John the Baptist?
No,
Yeah.
John,
Right,
either one of the disciples. Well, sorry, either one of the 12 or possibly another John that was among the disciples. Because there's John the disciple. There's John James and John. There's then there's John of Patmos. There's John of John. Why am I forgetting?
Just a very
Many
common
Johns.
name.
There are multiple Johns, and so it's
Yeah,
tricky.
The
One
good old
right
days, the
Because-
golden age of John.
There's also 12. There's also 12. There's also beyond the 12. There's the 70. There's the 70 disciples who are frequently in and around and following, and people that were part of the movement that were not part of the 12. There's
But you never hear about them.
you hear him vaguely mentioned, but Mary Magdalene wasn't part of the 12, but she was certainly part of the 70.
Right.
They asked her when when everybody goes their separate ways to preach the Bible and so forth, which way does she decide to go?
She
Down
just
or
gets
with
lost to
someone
history.
who's
There-
gone?
Da Vinci Code.
Well, one thing that I will say about one thing I will say.
Ashlyn did her paper on Mary Magdalene.
Yeah, Ashlyn did her paper on Mary Magdalene.
Who's
Yeah.
Ashley?
She's a
Ashlyn.
confirmand.
Ashlyn Taylor, for last confirmation class.
I'd like to see that.
Yeah.
I'd like to see that.
I got a copy of it, it was really good.
But
I would like to, yeah.
what's interesting to me, and I think is very much to the credit of the women in the movement, is that the men spent a lot of time talking about the finer theological points and bickering and writing things down, and the women sort of got to the business of helping the poor and doing practical things. And so we don't have a lot from the women, but
They're just as important.
yeah, well, they did a lot of they certainly did.
And
There-
they were seen as important by many of the writers of the Gospels, but because of the traditions, they
Yeah.
weren't named or they didn't, you know.
If you read, this is a novel, but have you read The Book of Longings?
No,
No.
It's by Sue Monk Kidd. She's
I know that
wrote
name.
The Secret Life of Bees.
Oh, I've heard of that
Oh,
book.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's the story of Jesus' wife.
Oh.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
called what?
The Book of Longings, but it's a novel. You know,
Yeah.
this
No, I
is
wanna know so
it's
I
a
can look it
fiction.
up.
it's
Yeah.
a really good read.
There's an
They
there.
don't meet until Jesus is 18 and they marry,
Yeah.
and
Book
it's just
The Book of Bees?
Longing.
long.
The Book of
Oh.
Longing. There's,
You know what the
yeah.
Nazis say about that? What section of the library is that book in? Fiction!
It's funny.
But so yes, it's fiction, and the main character is fictional, but she does all of her
She
research.
fills out her research.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that these people all around the fictional characters
You
who
learn
are
more.
doing fictional things
Mhm.
really did some of what she writes about.
Yeah.
It kind of helps put your mind, like what we're learning in this class, put your mind in that location
It
and
was
time.
a good book.
People have speculated that Jesus, like, it would have been weird for a man of Jesus's age, a rabbi or
Yeah.
whatever else, to have not been married. People have suggested, but one thing that I want to say is, because every week I'm washing dishes, I'm listening to lectures, I'm listening to things. There are people who make the field of biblical scholarship is so rife with many perfectly well reasoned, perfectly contextualized, well reasoned art, speculations. And one of my favorite things that I ever heard on the subject of Jesus, whether he was married or not, was many things are possible. People say, well, it would have been weird for him not to be. I'm not sure that's true, because the Essene community had a lot of celibates, and frankly, I think that there's a good reason to think that he had some association with the Essene community.
Because
John the Baptist was probably associated with them on some level too.
So John the Baptist never got married either?
Probably
Who
not.
knows? But that's the thing. This person said that there are lots of speculations, good arguments this way or that, but it's simply not information the Bible gives us. And I loved that point. But
And anytime if you get a chance, these study Bibles up here, they have Bruce Metzger and Roland Murphy are the editors. I actually knew those two people in my younger days. But they give you a lot of background too, like who do you think wrote it, and Brad just said, the Bible doesn't tell you certain things. And so these scholars are saying, well, we don't know.
right.
So who wrote the book of John? Well, we don't know. And they, they do all their research for you, and they condense it to this paragraph. So it was, published close to the near the 1st century. It was accepted as authentic, as an apostolic testimony. And so if you get a chance, if you ever in the building, or borrow one and take it home, because they have, it's really cool if you're curious.
There's also something, Jesus makes a comment also in the New Testament, in the Gospels, about how there are, for some people it's very hard, for other people it's easier, but that that basically he alludes to celibacy or something, you know, of that sort as being a gift, a thing that is actually kind of, that's like, that's perfect. And for a lot of people, it's not the easiest thing.
So the Catholics really latched onto that.
Yeah.
Of course.
So did the early monastics.
Yeah.
A lot of
Yeah.
people.
What was
In
the
fact, monastics, monks.
Monks.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
the early monastics did it, and it was highly prized in the early church in the early few centuries. Who was it? It was like Gregory of Nyssa or one of the three big. He wrote something about his sister, praising how wonderful a person she was. It was one of the three. I can't be sure it was Gregory of Nyssa, but I think it
Who's
was
sister?
Gregory of Nyssa's praising his sister, and it was like called On Virginity or something like that. And that basically she was just this wonderful like, picture what a nun is meant to be, right? Like a nun is meant to be serving, like.
No, don't picture the nun.
You know,
Sister
oh no, I mean like bride,
Sadistic.
like sadistic, horrible, but like picture what a nun is. Like a nun is kind of, it's all modeled on that idea.
Sound of music, you know, let's
Right.
use those.
Yeah, Sound of
ones.
Music.
Those are really good.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
the kind of bride of
Raise
Christ,
that
fully dedicated to service and forego and trying to basically turn themselves, into a thing that is not otherwise drawn by our more animalistic tendencies, and fully, operating on spiritual impulses and giving in that way. And he wrote a thing about how just fantastic his sister was, and how fantastic she was. And it was something like On Virginity. But my point is that it even traces back to the words of Jesus, where he says, so there's every reason to think that like he may have been himself doing exactly this.
So there's a joke, you know, about when the Pope dies, and
Yeah.
he goes up to heaven and meets St. Peter and escorts him in, and God says, do you have any questions? And he says, not really. I said, I have one question though about celibacy, you know, that I lived my life as a celibate person, and God looks at him and says, celibacy? I meant celebrate, not celibate. And after all these years.
No, there's actually,
That is a good one.
it's interesting because it is always pitted up against this, you know, like go forth and multiply, you know, be that kind of be fruitful and multiply thing. Those two things are often sort of pitted against each other. But Peter was married. We know that.
Yeah.
Paul alludes to, we don't know whether he was married or wasn't married, but he alludes to living a celibate life and saying, this is preferable, you should live like me if you can, but if you can't hack it, don't just go, you know,
Don't be impure.
don't just go around sleeping with anybody, everything. Get married and, you know, and have that relationship. But anyway, to get back to Jesus, Jesus's birth, there's Paul is the earliest that we have, the earliest literature in the New Testament that we have. He does not appear to know anything about Jesus's birth. Skipping past the other more debatable epistles, Mark is the earliest gospel. He does not have anything about the nativity. Matthew and Luke do. John, whoever authored it, does not. But he does take it all the way back, and he's like, well, in the beginning of everything was Jesus, was God. You know, Jesus was with God, and was, you know, and the Word was God. And, so Jesus is born one way or the other. he's born, and he's raised after a brief early period. He is believed to have gone to be in Egypt for a period of time, and then he is brought back and raised in Nazareth, in Galilee, a territory in the northern part of Israel. So he's a northerner. With the exception of the nativity and the story of him at 12 years old in the temple, we have no other stories about him that are in the Bible. There are some non-canonical stories about him as a child, some of them with him being less than pleasant, he kills another, he pushes another kid, and kid dies, and he raises
Jesus said that?
Mhm.
Oh.
And he raises the kid from the dead. Makes some clay
Oh,
pit.
that's
He makes some clay birds and
So
then makes them
I
real.
knew that story, but I
Yeah.
didn't know the pushing the
Yeah.
other kid.
Houdini.
That was in a movie about the clay bird and the.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, it's but yeah, there are stories. There are non-canonical stories that are later writings that are ostensibly about Jesus' childhood, but within the Bible we don't have anything aside from his episode when he was 12, and then he arrives fully like 30 years old or something at John the Baptist. The next thing that we see is his baptism by his cousin John the Baptist. It's believed that he began. Many scholars think that he may have begun as a disciple of John the Baptist. John the Baptist appears to have been engaged in a ministry that is not identical to, but very, very possibly strongly associated with the Essene community. But the Essenes were very communal, and John seems to have been doing his own thing.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit different. But Jesus, the story of Jesus. So it's at least evident that even if he wasn't a direct disciple of John the Baptist, he had his own ministry of baptism that he pursued, even parallel to John. So while John was baptizing, like partway up the river, he was baptizing at another location further south, I believe. I think he was in the south. So they actually seem to have some people think that they may have been kind of splitting the duties and trying to hit the countryside and baptizing people.
But they were preaching the same thing, basically.
Arguably, yeah. Now, one thing I didn't put in here, but is an interesting episode, is a very interesting episode because it raises a lot of questions and kind of is very interesting, and that Jesus appears to have had a period of asceticism.
What?
So the word asceticism is, I think it's very, very interesting. It comes from the Greek askesis, but we know it with a C. And that is we tend to think of it as a kind of a world-denying, pleasure-denying rigor. You know what I mean? We tend to think of it associated with monks and associated with other people who I eat a little bit of rice each day, and then I mostly drink water, and that's it. Or, I wear, really rough clothing, and I don't indulge in any pleasures, and I just hope, with all of my being, that at some point I'll shuffle off this mortal coil, and then my spirit will go off to heaven, and then I'll truly live. And in fact, some of this gets a little bit closer to later Gnostic tradition, which believed that they could gradually shed this horrible mortal, materialist thing. It's heavily dualistic, meaning that there's this stuff, the material stuff, and then there's the heavenly stuff, and that's it. I don't want to imply that there is no asceticism or that there is no dualism in Christianity or in its origins or in Judaism or whatever, but the idea fundamentally that kind of is heavily present, this dualistic Gnosticism that we associate with asceticism is about, don't worry, I'll give you a vocab handout. But the point is that there's this idea that the world is bad. And that's the difference. That the world is bad, that the world is just all sorts of animal instincts and pleasures and stuff like that, and that if you do that, you're bad, and what you really need to do is you need to somehow I gotta avoid all of this, so that's not, I think it's safe to say that's not really there in Christianity.
No.
In Jesus and his movement.
God so loved the world.
The world.
That's
There
kind
is,
of
the creation is good,
Yeah.
but it is not perfect. The creation is good, but it is not perfect. And the real meaning of ascesis is not renunciation. It is not denial of the world. The real meaning of ascesis is discipline. And you'll notice that he was a rabbi who took disciples. This is about learning. It is about learning. It is about being. It is about, I mean, this is there are a couple more words I'm going to throw out here. Don't worry, Jennifer. It is about, there is, in many respects, there is, you need the discipline, you need the whatever, because this is fundamentally teleological. This is why it has an eschatology. Eschatology is like the end point. Telos means goal, end point, or purpose. And do you know what the word sin is? Do you know what the word sin means?
To do really, really bad things.
No. We think of the sin as like a block thing, like, well, that's a broken rule. There's a rule about that, and you broke it, so it's an infraction. We think of it as an infraction, as a broken rule, as a this. That's not what the word sin means. The word sin is an archery term, and it means to miss the mark.
Oh, that's
Hamartia.
Oh, hamartia.
Hamartia means to miss the mark.
Interesting.
And so
And that's the word they use in the New Testament to talk about sin.
about sin. Now, if there's an aim, a purpose, or a goal, you know, if I'm like, you know, like I'm just aiming wrong, people go, it's over there, dude, that's the target, right? And what do I have to do if I want to stop missing the mark and actually begin to improve my aim?
Focus.
So towards that goal. Well, I'm going to have to change my mind, alter my understanding and perception. And the word for change your mind, which is actually to repent. Metanoia. Metanoia means to change your mind, alter your perception. It does not mean to feel contrition, regret, or sorrow. It might entail those things. If you go, wow, I've been a massive a-hole and I feel really bad about that. you might, yeah,
Harmed a relationship.
you could absolutely feel contrition upon changing your mind or altering your perception. But in order to better aim at your goal, you might need to alter your perception. And John the Baptist's ministry was about repentance. Jesus also was about, it's important to remember, because we're kind of living in an interesting time where there are people who are grasping onto really, really legalistic views of the church or Christianity or whatever, but there's also a group that says, you know, Jesus was really about love and acceptance. Well, that's not exactly true either, because it's important to remember that while there's a difference between judgment, which he told his disciples constantly to use, so it's not a never judge, it's a don't condemn. It don't condemn people, use good judgment, and it's not just nonstop acceptance. In fact, every person that came to him that he forgave, he then told them, go and sin no more. Stop aiming wild. Really focus. And so these are words that really could use a little bit of reviving, that we understand them better so that we don't perpetuate unfortunate ways of thinking about them. But it was, the ministries early on were about metanoia, were about a change of mind. They were about repentance. And Jesus' ministry repeatedly went out to help people with how they missed the mark. And he went out to be with sinners, to people who were struggling with their viewpoint and doing things that were not working towards a particular goal.
I'm thinking of the story of the Pharisees saying, it's a good thing I'm not like that guy in the
Right.
temple. And then the other guy who's saying, oh, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. He wants to turn around. He wants to find a way.
Right. And it's
That's
interesting
not
because if you say,
It's the mark.
if you are alert enough that you are actually like, well, I know the goal is over there, but I'm aiming over here. I'm aiming over here. Jesus has a whole section in one of his sermons where he says, if you see people doing this and people doing that,
Like the
they've
lady-
got what they want.
Like
Yeah.
what they
Yeah.
were throwing the stones to the lady who was whatever.
Well, not exactly that. It's more the prayer. Don't be like these people because,
Do as I say, but not as I do.
well, no, it's the scene where he says this person who's praying loudly in church or whatever else, like they aren't missing the mark. They have a different aim.
Their aim
they wanna
is
be
to
seen.
Right, to be seen,
They want-
adored,
yeah.
and-
They want this,
Lord, they
and you
pray.
know what? They got it.
Yeah,
Good
they
for
This is
got
them.
what they
basically,
want.
for me, this would be like confession.
Yeah.
When I
Yeah,
was
that
Catholic.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically that,
Yeah,
you sin, you miss the mark.
go
That
on
makes
after.
There you
Right.
go. You
Yeah.
acknowledge it,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of psychological
Say-
power to that.
Say 10, you know, Hail Marys
Yeah.
and, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
say the rosary a couple times and.
Yeah.
So that's the whole idea.
Yeah, that's sort of like, you know, the repetition of those things is a kind of discipline,
Mhm.
right? But it's the confession that is the real awareness. There is
Awareness.
real
Yeah,
psychological.
That was one of the things I really was looking forward to being a priest, was being on the other side of that.
Yeah,
You were gonna be a
Confessional.
priest.
I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way.
I actually went to confession at the Vatican, and I went in and I told, because I was like, well, I've always been curious about confession, but I've never been.
Well,
Yeah,
And so I went to one of the English speaking ones,
Okay.
and he goes, I sit down, and he's in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blah, blah, blah. I said, Amen. He just sat there. I said, I don't really know what I'm doing. He goes, are you Catholic? And I go, no. And he goes, well, then why are you here? I said, well,
I thought
I'm at
it'd
the
be a good
Vatican.
idea.
I've always been curious about confession. I've got some things I'm not proud of, so I suppose I figured what better time? He goes,
Uh-huh.
well, not being Catholic, I can't really take your confession. I said, I think I knew that. And he goes,
Oh my
well,
God.
if you want to step out and around, I can talk to you just personally,
Like
face to
one
face,
one, yeah.
but I can't really give you the sacrament of confession.
Oh my
I said,
Lord.
okay.
Yeah.
And then he
So
sort of,
did he come?
well, he mostly tried to tell me all the wonders of being a Benedictine or whatever it was.
I was
But
gonna say, you wanted to make it Catholic, yeah.
See, we always knew who to go to, who would give you the least.
Which
amount of-
priest?
Really?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I
You
don't
would
have
make
to
sure you
do
looked
20
at that
Hail Marys
confession,
and Our
you know,
Father.
Yeah.
Cause there were 4, there were 2 on one side, 2 on
Yeah,
each side.
yeah.
You're
Yeah.
right.
In our church, it was
Yeah.
a smaller church,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah.
well, to get back to Jesus, there's an episode early on after Jesus is baptized. He goes out for 40 days to the wilderness. He goes out into the desert for 40 days, where he is tempted by Satan. The word Satan means adversary. And it could be, there are multiple Satans listed in the New Testament, the multiple antichrists, I suppose I should say, but Satan is, unless it says like Ha-Satan, which means the Satan, and even that could be a little bit
That's
vague.
scary.
It means adversary, but because there are ways of missing the mark or aiming wrong or needing to change your mind, this is how Jesus was able to look at Peter and say, get thee behind me, Satan, you're thinking as men think,
He is
not
an
as God
adversary.
thinks. He was displaying an adversarial spirit, adversarial to the aims and goal. It's like, no, we got to keep you alive. We got to protect you. We'll look at, he's like, no, this has to happen. No! Suddenly he can say, you're tempting me. You're tempting me to save my own life.
So stop it.
And so you are and he calls him Satan to his face. So anyway, but he goes out and he's tempted by Satan, by whatever, that means. He's tempted by Satan in the desert with 3 temptations, and then he overcomes them. He comes back and his ministry begins in earnest, in full throttle. His ministry is believed to have lasted roughly 3 years, largely involving his wandering the territory of Galilee and some other regions, including not within the bounds of Israel. But and his preaching an interpretation of the Jewish law, healing the sick, working wonders, and was reported to have revived some people, especially a really, really dead man. So there's dead people, and then there's dead people. There's when he revives Jairus' daughter, they're like, she's dead, and he's like, she's not dead, just sleeping. And they're like, okay, but she's dead. But he raises her right then. Lazarus is a slightly different story. Jewish,
He was rotten.
he was
Mhm.
Jew.
He was done with
He
a
smelled
tornado.
Yeah.
He smelled that.
People
Yeah.
believe
They even said that.
people tend to. That's why they said it, and in fact,
Yeah.
that's why Jesus waited. He said he knew he was sick unto death, but Jesus went slowly, and they said, if you had come, he would have been like, he goes, but I didn't come, and now you're going to believe. There was a general belief that spirits tended to linger for a little while before departing after 3 or 4 days. 4 days later, they go, but he's been dead for like 4 days.
All the
He's
spirits are gone.
there's no there anymore, and he goes, roll it away, and he raises a very, very dead man. And he meets with social outcasts. In many ways, his interpretation of the law was much more lenient, not unlike, I think we mentioned that not unlike some of the more Hillel-style Pharisees, who really became the dominant group that sort of the Pharisaic Judaism of Jesus' time becomes, after the destruction of the temple, 60 depending on when you time where you're going by his birth or his death, in 70 AD, after the temple is destroyed and there is no temple-centric Judaism anymore, you get what's called rabbinic Judaism, which is what we have still today. And Pharisaism is basically rabbinic Judaism. It's directly from Pharisaism, not so much Sadducees, definitely not Essenes, etc. But so it has a lot in common with Hillel-style Pharisaism and is more lenient, but in other ways it's more stringent in ways that people kind of balked at. So like he makes the marriage things more strong. He makes, even though people are like, they're like, if you're guilty of murder if you even think about harming your brother. You're like, what? Like, so there are a whole bunch of what are called the hard passages sometimes.
Yeah.
Though he does have encounters with and preaches about other groups and ethnicities, his primary ministry is to his fellow children of Israel, and it's something that he states openly. He mentions it to the Syrophoenician woman who says, yeah, but, do not the puppies get the scraps too, from the children's table. And he's like, you got it, sister. And yeah. So, He gathers a following and sends out his disciples into broader areas to proclaim a message of good news to the common people. That we'll talk about another time. Like, what exactly does that mean? Because you'll notice that he sends people out to preach the gospel before his death. However, most people you ask on the street would say that the gospel is all about his death. That raises some interesting questions.
Yeah.
But when his travels take him and the disciples to Jerusalem and to the temple, the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, fears that his popularity will make the Romans anxious and cause potential military intervention, which is not super duper common at Jesus' time, but had been in decades prior. They had put down other revolts. But somebody made an interesting point. They said that the Sanhedrin of the time, Caiaphas and the Annas, which there's Annas, I think, father and Annas son, that they said it kind of reads like it was mafioso, like that it's kind of mafia-esque, that there's a lot of nepotism and not that it's actually kind of a shady time in the Sanhedrin's history, but. So they bring Jesus to Pilate on trumped-up charges, and Jesus is put to death by crucifixion for sedition against Rome. And when they put what his crime was above him on the cross, it's specifically sedition. It's it's for being king of the Jews.
What?
What's that?
INRI means what?
Means Jesus Nazarenum Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in Latin.
Right, and they all thought the Jews were so foolish in the silly little
Backwater.
religious,
They respected old religions, so they did like that. Jewish people were totally welcome to practice their religion by Roman standards. They were actually cool with that, but they did kind of consider it sort of a backwater, and they did, and new movements were less, rumors of Jesus' bodily resurrection from the tomb and sightings began shortly after his execution and the inability of his followers to locate the body after its initial entombment. It's interesting to observe that the main thing that is said early on by Mary Magdalene, who's the person, is, where did you put him? Right? She doesn't, like, the sightings are a slightly separate event. Like, she sees a person there and they go, he's not here, why would you look for him here? Right?
Then all of a sudden he shows up like Casper the Friendly Ghost.
But not there. But what she's wondering is, there are some people who think there's good reason to believe that his body was put into this tomb kind of in haste, because there's a lot about to happen. There's a lot of stuff you're not allowed to be doing on Sabbaths and on holidays, which is right. This is during Passover, and so there's some good reason to think that his birth was kind of like, let's get him in the, and then when they come back for it, it's not there, and that is part of what's going on. What happened, obviously, the belief is that it was resurrection. The nature of that is also a little bit uncertain, because it seems to have been bodily, and there's an empty tomb and people seem to have encountered him, but his body doesn't act like a normal body. And so he's able to kind of appear in places, despite locked doors. He seems to be able to be touched and seems to be able to eat, but also is not recognized by people who knew him very well until he does something symbolic.
And eating and shit.
Yeah, and they go, oh, it's
what
you.
he actually does.
Yeah, and then there, for Paul, his experience appears to have been something that didn't act completely materially at all. Like, he could see stuff, and other people could hear him, but they couldn't see it.
Yeah. And imagination is the gift. I use that term. I got it from the play Joan of Arc, when she was accused. Where do you get all these things that you're talking about? And she says, from my imagination. That's from God too. I forget the name of the play. I forget that.
There is
I forget the play. It was a Joan of Arc play. I can't remember. We had to read it.
one of the Dead Sea Scholars. He kind of discredited himself a little bit, but he was a proper scholar. He wrote a book called Jesus or Christianity and the Sacred Mushroom or something like that. And that there is, so the
That
thoughts.
was in the news recently. I mean, in this Bible thing that I was watching about
We probably have.
So yeah, we gotta go. But one thing that I want to point out, there's a clip.
What?
There's a clip I was that I showed to the class, and I may email it out. But there's a clip, and it's worth observing that in a lot of the stories that Jesus tells, or in a lot of the movies that we see, the way that they're presented is usually not quite right. And there's a moment in the movie, the great Zeffirelli movie of Jesus of Nazareth, where he reads in the synagogue and he says, I come to bring something to the poor, bring hope to the poor, and blah blah blah. And he reads Isaiah, and then he says, "Today in your hearing, this has been fulfilled." And people go, "That can only be fulfilled by the coming of the Messiah. Who are you to say this?" And they get really, really angry at him, and they chase him out of the synagogue.
Himself, like today.
And what's interesting, though, is that that's not accurate. When he said that in the story, in the Bible, actually, everybody gets really excited. They're really jazzed about it. They're like, "Really? Cool. That's awesome. Fantastic. We're so happy. The Messiah's coming. Awesome. Is it you? That'd be great." But what he says then is he follows it by saying that in the days of Elijah, nobody was sent. That Elijah was not sent to anybody within Israel. He was sent to the widow of Zarephath. In the days of so-and-so, nothing was sent to whatever. It was sent to other people. Almost every time that we think of Jesus as telling a story to his fellow Jews and saying, this is a good story for your moral whatever, when they get really ticked off at him, it's because at some point in the story he goes, and who did the right thing? Not you. It was the Samaritans. That's the Good Samaritan story. He basically says in certain ways, and then I pointed out in his ministry, occasionally he does something and encounters somebody else and says, this Roman centurion has it right, and you barely understand. And you're the people of Israel. You should know this, and only he's right. That widow, that's, you know, the woman of the Syrophoenician woman. She gets it right. And he later tells a story about the woman and the judge. He lets this woman beg him and pester him for it, and he's like,
Oh,
all right. And then later he tells a story about the woman pestering the judge who will get what she wants. And he gets his fellow Jews really angry at him by regularly saying that this is not just about us, and you are not necessarily the most virtuous just cause. You know, there's more going on here. It's bigger than us, but we are part of this story, a major part, and we need to get our stuff together. So,
that's
yeah.
even in
But you
old.
missed the most important part.
What's that?
Jesus was actually Irish.
Was he?
No way.
He didn't leave home until he was 30. Hung around and drank with 12 other guys.
That sounds right.
His
Yeah.
mother thought he was God, and he thought she was a virgin.
Right. There's that. Have you heard that Jim Gaffigan thing where he says, because that must have been an awkward conversation when Mary goes to Joseph and says, "Hey, Joseph." Yeah. Well, you know how we've never had sex? Yeah. Well, turns out I'm pregnant. Jesus Christ. Oh, you already know about it.